Dear church, let's talk Christianity and comedy with Brian Bates. Hello and welcome to the Dear Church Podcast. I'm your host, Chris McCurley. I'm excited about my guest today. Brian Bates is joining us. Brian, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, so a little bit about you, and then I'll turn it over to you. But for our guests that are tuning in, Brian is in the stand-up comedy world. He hosts the Nateland Podcast with Nate Bargatze and other guests. And Brian is also someone who's not far from me here in Dixon, lives in the Nashville area, and doing great things. And I wanted to have you on today to talk a little bit about your career and also how faith intersects with that. And but before we do that, just tell us a little bit about yourself. I know that in some of your shows you talk about being a father now and how that kind of came a little bit later. So tell us anything and everything you want to about your life and about family.
Yeah, so I got started in stand-up comedy really late by stand-up comedy standards. When I was 35 years old, I took a stand-up comedy class just kind of for fun. And it was a 4-week class. I really didn't have any aspirations, just thought it'd be a fun thing to do. But I really enjoyed it. And, I'd never met a stand-up comedian. I really didn't think they were people I could probably identify with or become friends with. But the teacher was a great Christian man, still is. I just had lunch with him today, Rick Roberts, and he was, kind of a godsend to me because he was such a good influence, and I really enjoyed his class. So I took the next one and the next one, and it was a long process. I didn't quit my day job anytime soon, but for 8 years I kept my day job, and then I would do stand-up comedy on the side, and then finally at age 43, I quit my job and went full-time into stand-up comedy. And I was single at the time. I'd never been married. My thinking was, hey, if I do this and I fail, I'll only be hurting myself.
Right.
And I've succeeded, and thankfully. And then I got married for the first time at 48. And then we thought, hey, let's just keep the late train going. So we had our first child when I was 50. So I'm now 53 years old and have a 2.5-year-old. So part of my act now is talking about being married late in life, having a kid at 50, and I'm also Church of Christ. So I have a couple of Church of Christ jokes in there as well.
Yeah, I was going to say that having a child now, you've opened up the door to all sorts of material that maybe you didn't have access to before, right?
Oh, for sure. When I first started doing stand-up, a big part of my act was being single in my 30s and 40s and what that was like. Yeah. And then when I got married, my friends said, well, what are you going to talk about? Like, you're losing your whole act. But now, then it kind of evolved into talking about being married late in life and what that's like. And now about having a kid late in life. So just whatever's happening in your life, is what I try to talk about. And that progresses with, whatever happens.
I have often said, Brian, that preaching is a lot like, well, not that I know a lot about stand-up comedy, but that they're very similar. I'm a student of guys like Jerry Seinfeld, Brian Regan, Nate Bargatze, those kind of guys. And I've noticed when you hear them talk, they talk about how they get material, how they fine-tune it, and they'll go to like a comedy club late at night and kind of get their act honed in, and then before they do it on a Netflix special or something like that. And I feel like preaching is kind of the same way. I pay attention, I observe things around me, of course, go to the text as well, and then you're trying to craft it just right so you say it exactly for the right effect. Talk a little bit about where you get material. I mean, you already have a little bit, but how difficult is it to come up with new material and then to go and present it, and what is that like?
Yeah, well, it's changed because when I first started trying stand-up comedy, I certainly wasn't getting paid anywhere to do it. Mm-hmm. I was just going wherever they would have me, and that was mostly open mics around Nashville. Sure. And you get 4 minutes or something like that, and it's not a great audience. There's a lot of obstacles, but that's where you just go and you try out new jokes, and see what happens. And it takes a long time to really find your voice, as they say, kind of what, you're about. And most of it's terrible. And even the stuff I thought was good then, I look back on now, and I'm sure you probably felt the same ways about some old sermons. And
absolutely,
you're like, oh, I thought that was good at the time, but now I can't hardly watch it. And now it's gotten to where I am very busy, thankfully, doing stand-up comedy on the road, and I'm getting paid to do this, so I can't be trying out material that much on a real show. But if I'm doing an hour of comedy, I'll try to weave in some new jokes there in the middle and try to test them out that way. And it's kind of the only way for me to do it. Now that I have a child, I'm gone enough where on nights I'm home, I can't be going to open mic, to try out stuff now that I'm a dad. But so now it's kind of changed. And then as far as coming up with the material, the more you do in life, the more things come to, because I just talk about life experiences. So getting married and having a child have certainly added a ton of material to my act. But just getting out, like if I'm on the road, instead of staying in a hotel room, I try to get out, go do things, experience things, because that's where a lot of your great material comes from. And, the challenging part is now I am so busy as a dad and just everything else in life that you got to give your brain time to process it and be creative. Sure. Many of my ideas, and I bet you've experienced this too, is when you're in the shower or cutting the grass, something where you're not looking at your phone and you give your brain a second to think. Yeah, right. I keep a notepad by my bed because so many times I'll wake up in the middle of the night with an idea or something and I scratch it down. So what, talk a little bit about this trajectory that you mentioned that you weren't getting paid before, and now you're traveling and you're busy. This is a career now. Right. Talk about how, that's got to be a little surreal, doesn't it? It is. Now I feel like I just started, but time flies, and it'll be 18 years come this January that I've been doing this. It hasn't been like an overnight thing. It's been a long process, as it is for most of us. And the first few years I got no pay or little pay, and then I start making a little money to the point where I'd saved up and could quit my job. And then thankfully things have just grown from there and built from there. But it was certainly a slow process. And if you do it, much like preaching, if you do it for the money, you're going to probably be disappointed. Yeah, exactly. Are you getting to that point now where, this is something where you have to pick and choose where you go and things like that because you're recognizable and things like that, and that's got to be different too, right? It is. I'm not so in demand that I'm turning down a lot of gigs, but more it's just, again, being a husband and a dad now, I'm not just taking everything because family time's important. So, you gotta weigh what's more important for us as a family, me making some money for our family doing this or being home with my family. And that's what I weigh more than anything. I'm busy, but I haven't gotten so in demand where I'm, you don't have to book me 2 years out. I'll say that. Right. Well, but still, this is, I watch your stuff and love it. And one of the things that I love about you is the genuineness. I feel like that in preaching as well, that just be you, just be genuine. Don't get into character and things like that. Is this something that you decided very early on is, look, I'm not going to go to the route of taking, cheap shots and vulgarity and all that kind of stuff, that I'm just going to be me and I'm going to be wholesome and clean and that kind of thing. If it's not funny, it's not funny. Was that a conscious decision or it's just who you are? Well, I guess both. It is who I am. So I never considered being a dirty comedian with language or with content. Now, again, when I first started, I was never dirty. I was always clean by the standards of those around me because they're filthy.
Right.
But I have jokes when I first started that I look back on now, and they were just because I wasn't good enough comedian. I would not tell them now just because they're a little too edgy or a little too risque, and I'm a little embarrassed by them now. But when you're just starting out, you're just trying to get laughs, and so I would push it to the edge more than I do now. But I've always been a clean comedian, and that's just who I am. If I tried to be something else, I think the audience would sense that it's unauthentic. And thankfully, that's really blessed me in so many ways. Being a clean comedian has opened so many doors for me because not only can I do comedy clubs, I can do corporate events, I can do churches. Anything's a possibility if you can be clean and be funny, because there's just, there's not many of us out there.
Yeah, that's true. When is the point, Brian, where you realized, hey, I think I can make a living at this. It's time to quit my job. I mean, what was that moment like? Was there a pivotal moment where you said, yeah, I'm going to do this because I think I can make it?
Mm-hmm. Well, I was looking at my finances. That was the biggest thing. And I was living a pretty frugal life, and I'd been saving for some time because I had this in my mind that someday I want to try this. And again, I was single, so therefore the cost of living was a lot less. And I thought I had an idea in mind when I'd like to quit my job. So I thought I'm going to attempt to live the last 6 months of my job here, living only off my stand-up comedy salary, just to see if I can make it. You know what I mean? So I put away all the other money and just lived off stand-up comedy, and I was doing it. So that was a pretty good indication. I felt like, well, then I can do this, you know? And that's what I did. The last 6 months of my job, I only lived off of stand-up comedy income, and it worked.
Yeah. Yeah. So talk a little bit about faith and how it influences your comedy. I'm sure it influences your everyday life, but what is there a challenge sometimes? I know this is my second career. I was a coach, and as a high school basketball and baseball coach, there were times where it was hard to keep your Christianity, especially in the throes of a game when it wasn't going your way. Have you found that to be true in this chosen career, or how does faith saturate what you do?
It hasn't been too challenging for me. I feel like I've been very fortunate that God has placed me around a lot of successful, clean stand-up comedians that had similar backgrounds as myself. So you mentioned Nate Bargatze. Nate lives here in Nashville. He's clean, and he's about as big of a stand-up comedian as there is right now. And the fact that I was clean opened a lot of doors. We kind of bonded. And then there's a lot of clean stand-up comedians in Nashville, and that's just good fortune that is the case. So therefore, if anything, in Nashville, not anywhere else I can think of, maybe the societal pressure for comedians is to be clean. But now, sure, like I said, when I first started, I would tell some jokes that I probably wouldn't tell now because I just wanted to try to get laughs. And I did feel that pressure when everyone else is just being filthy. I'm like, well, I'm not going to be filthy, but I'm going to at least try to dip my toe in the water and try to get some laughs. So I did feel pressure then. Sometimes when I'm on the road in other parts of the country, my act's the same everywhere, but, they're not going to get, I still tell that though, they're not going to get some of the references that I make to either being a Christian or being from the South, for that matter. So, but I don't pretend to be something I'm not no matter where I'm at. And, so really, I hate to say this, but being a Christian is it's come full circle to where that's kind of the niche thing to the point where it makes you stand out a little bit.
It does.
Nobody else in that world's doing it.
No, that's true. You mentioned these other guys that you've had associations with that, are also clean comedians. John Chris being one of them that's on the podcast. So how did the podcast come together? It's the Nateland Podcast. Nate Bargatze is on it, and you are the facilitator, the host, if you will. But how did that all come together?
Yeah, so that all came due to COVID. I mean, Nate had talked about doing a podcast, but his schedule was so busy, and to get all that up and going is an undertaking. But then when COVID hit and we're all locked in our homes or not traveling, doing shows anywhere, he was like, I gotta start a podcast just to keep the message out there. So he asked me to come on board and as a producer and co-host, and then we added Aaron Weber, another very funny Nashville comedian. And then later we added Dusty Slay. So really because of COVID, I mean, at the time when all my jobs had gone away because due to COVID and it was a dark time, that was tough. But then what came from it is this podcast, which has led to so many doors opening for me because I've gotten exposure I would have never gotten if it wasn't for it.
Well, the podcast is great, and again, you are all over social media as well, Instagram, TikTok, and I follow all of those. And when my friend Keith Kasarjan says I have a potential guest idea for you, I said, well, who is it? And he said Brian Bates. I'm like, yeah. So he'll never do the podcast, right? He'll never come on the Dear Church podcast. And you were so gracious to just jump on it and say, yeah, I mean, absolutely. So I appreciate that. Hey, I don't mean to put you on the spot, so you don't have to answer this, but as a preacher, we all have that one sermon or two that, man, we love preaching it. Every time we get an opportunity to go and speak somewhere, they say, just bring your favorite sermon. You're like, oh, I know which one I'm going to do. Do you have that? Do you have that one joke that just kills every time you do it, that you just love telling every time?
Well, that's a good question. I love whenever I have a new joke that's killing, then that's my favorite joke, because there's nothing better than a new joke that works and you're like, now I got that in my arsenal. So it's a constant moving target. I mean, because we tend to get tired of anything after a while, the more we tell it. So therefore, if you have a new, fresh joke that's working, then that becomes my favorite. So I don't have a go-to that I've been telling. Obviously, I have certain jokes that I know will do better than others and jokes that I close on. And I guess those would be my favorite because they work the best. But I don't have like a joke I'm like, oh yeah, that's my always go-to. Yeah.
And your wife is okay with all your jokes?
Yeah. As long as the check clears. Here's what I have been doing though lately. When I go to churches and do shows, I will say off the top, I'm going to tell some jokes about my wife, but I want you guys to know she's heard all these jokes. She approves all these jokes and she's good with it. And I also say, I'm going to tell some jokes about my church. I love my church very much. And because sometimes people get a little tense in a church setting thinking, can I laugh at this? Or is this mean? Yeah. And I just want them to know everyone that I'm talking about is okay with it. And I mean, I make fun of myself by far the most, but I tell some jokes about my wife and I just want them to know it's okay to laugh at it. She's heard these jokes and she thinks they're funny.
Yeah, for sure. When I was in Abilene, Texas for 14 years, and we had a youth minister that should have been a stand-up comedian. He was hilarious, but we would have a table for wedding, future weddings, and they would have a picture of the couple on them, and we would go in and we would doctor the photo. And so you have a couple there, and they'd be on the beach. We'd put a shark in the background, or one time we even put a picture of us embracing behind in the background of these two couples embracing, and a sweet little lady, she was a little cantankerous. She walked by and she was upset and she said, what is this? And my youth minister friend, he said, well, it's humor. It's okay to laugh in church. And I think we don't always realize that you can be a Christian, you can have fun, you can laugh at yourself, laugh at others, and it's okay. And so I do appreciate that you said that about the disclaimer and everything, but also it's okay. Don't you think we need to laugh more?
Oh, of course. And now I understand we all have our own line, And there are jokes that if they were said in a church, I would find offensive and I would think, and we all have our own line I've told a couple of times in a church setting, I've told a joke that a little old lady complained about, to the preacher, and I found out about it later. And both times I thought, you got to be kidding me. That
right. That's your line.
Yeah. But I just have to realize we all have our own standards and our own line, but I try not to come close to crossing anything inappropriate. But at the same time, we got to make fun of ourselves. We got to, in a spiritual way, once I let people know, again, in a church setting, I have to really let them know off top, I'm a Christian. I'm not making fun of you. I'm in this with us together. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, Brian, so far in this 18-year career, what has been one of your most memorable moments?
Well, I've had so many. I don't know if you're familiar with Henry Cho. But when I first started in Nashville, everyone said, oh man, you got to meet Henry Cho. Henry Cho, he's clean, he's funny. He goes to Harpeth Hills Church of Christ, and I had a lot of friends that went there, and they're like, oh, you got to meet him, whatever. And I always wanted to. I always thought, man, if I could get in front of him and open for him, then that could, be such a great thing, because I was such a big fan of his. And I finally got that opportunity to open for him, and it went well. And I remember we went out to eat afterwards, and this was early in my career, and he offered me a couple more dates to open for him on the road. And that was one of my first, wow, this is like a breakthrough for me that, I finally got to meet this guy that I've idolized, and now we're still friends. I still do shows with Henry. I remember that was like a good milestone for me. And then last year, April of last year, I got to perform at Bridgestone Arena in Nashville. Nate Bargatze headlined Bridgestone Arena, and they set an attendance record there, 19,365 people. And I got to perform on stage in front of that many people, which I would have never imagined in a million years that I'd ever get to perform in front of that many people.
Yeah, that was incredible. I was keeping up with that. I didn't get tickets because we were out of town that same night, but I really wanted to be there for that. Recently on one of the podcast episodes, you mentioned you did an hour and 20 minutes.
Yeah.
How in the world do you have enough material to do an hour and 20 minutes?
I don't. That's the bottom line. No, I was performing at a comedy club a couple weeks ago in Arlington, Virginia, and generally a stand-up comedy show at a comedy club goes an hour and a half. That's the general time. Sometimes they'll go longer than that, but you at least try to go an hour and a half. And I'll usually do an hour at the most, and anywhere from 50 minutes to an hour, depending on how long the opening acts go. And the comedy club generally provides the opening comedians, and that could be 1, 2, sometimes 3 or more opening acts. And I got there that night, and they had one guy who wasn't even there yet. He was on his way. And when he showed up, he said, I'll do 10 or 15 minutes and then I got to go. Okay. And he did exactly 10 and then he left. So in my mind, I was thinking, all right, I got to make sure I do at least an hour just to give these people their money's worth. And I just went slow and took my time and didn't rush it and told, any joke that I felt like would work. I just told it. And when I got done, I wasn't shooting for this, but when I got done, I did an hour and 20 minutes, which plus his 10 minutes came out to an hour and a half show. And that's by far the most I've done. Well, I've done an hour or maybe a little over, but an hour 20 is the most I've ever done.
Yeah, that just seems like it would be really hard to do. I know I've been to a place where they told me when I was getting up to preach, they said, well, so you'll have an hour. And I'm like, wow, I preach 30 minutes usually. So it'd be difficult.
If you told me before I started, you got to do an hour 20, I would have been really nervous about it. And I was nervous about just trying to get to an hour, but it worked out. Yeah,
that's great. Brian, I'm going to let you go. I know you have other stuff to do. I want to thank you for being on today. But before I let you go, tell our viewers and listeners how to keep up with you. What's going on in the that's very, very soon coming up.
Yeah, well, you can learn about all my shows on my website, which is brianbatescomedy.com, or follow me on social media. I think it's Brian Bates Comic across Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all that. And then, I've got a lot of, I'm going to be a few places in Kentucky the next few weeks. I'm in Paducah, Kentucky on November 8th, and then Litchfield, Kentucky on November 16th, and London, Kentucky on November 17th. That just kind of worked out, all these different places in Kentucky. So if you live in Kentucky, maybe you want to come see me. And then I'm going to be in Fort Worth, Texas on, I believe, December 13th. And Lexington, back to Kentucky. Lexington, Kentucky, January 3rd and 4th. Those are some dates I remember right offhand. All those are on my website. So brianbatescomedy.com if you want to come check me out.
That's awesome. And I'm sure we will. And Brian, hey, thank you again. And thank all of our listeners and viewers for tuning in. If you have a question about today's episode, you can email me at chris.mccurley@rippleoflight.com. If you have a specific question for Brian, we can forward it on to him. I'm sure he'd be glad to answer any question you might have. And I just want to thank everyone. Thank you, Brian. And until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. Sincerely, Chris.
God has blessed me with a life of missionary service that has taken me from gang members in the large cities of the United States to the deepest jungles of Central Africa. Along the way, He's blessed me with the wisdom of many evangelists who have verbalized their faith so that others may know Jesus. In our series, we're going to be exploring the mission of God. Join us as we explore the mission of God.